Welcome, good morning, and my name is Bipin Kumar. I am the project coordinator at the Canadian Science Policy Center, and today we have Dr. Kristiann Allen, Executive Secretary of the International Network for Governmental Science Advice, also known as INGSA. Dr. Allen, thank you for joining us for the interview, and welcome to CSPC.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Allen, as the Executive Secretary of INGSA, you sit at a very crucial place in advising governments on science diplomacy and policy issues. What do you see? How do you see the governments should navigate the science diplomacy and policy, especially in times of the geopolitical tensions that we are seeing right now in the world today?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's ramped up in the last few years, as you can imagine, for precisely the reasons you point to, the geopolitical tensions. I think that science diplomacy can be defined in many ways. And this is an area of research and scholarship and field building that's happening currently. The provincial government in Quebec, for instance, has only just launched and has announced several chairs in science diplomacy, and that's really groundbreaking, right? To be able to say, this is an area that we need to look at in a scholarly way as well as in a practitioner way. And there's many practitioners who've been doing this for years and haven't called it science diplomacy. So that, I think, needs to be recognized. And I also think that traditional diplomats should now start to be able to view the science community as also a bit of, I don't want to say a tool in their toolkit, but at least somebody to have a conversation with and to see where there can be some synergies to be helpful. There's questions, of course, of national interest in the diplomatic sphere, and there's questions of collective global interest and working at a multilateral level that scientists can be really meaningfully engaged in.
You mentioned about scientists being meaningfully engaged in the diplomacy process, especially in the current politically sensitive times and everything. How do governments specifically focus more on increasing resilience in the science ecosystem that we are seeing as these tensions and instabilities? Usually the governments have short-term priorities and the science always takes a backseat. How do you see the science policy or diplomacy having resilience in these kind of uncertain times?
Yeah, the resilience one is a really great question. And you're right that science is not always front and center in difficult times where we need sort of geopolitical resilience, but also economic resilience. And again, I think increasingly, and I've studied this personally in my own research, the science community really does start to, for certain governments, become sort of another type of interlocutor that they know that they could reach out to, increasingly understanding them as such. So I think that the science community working more in groupings of mission-led science is a really helpful way to look at this. So looking at certain missions that are of global interest and building your networks and your communities of scientists around that. And of course, the really fundamental question is funding for research. I mean, researchers will always welcome more funding, but to view that funding as strategic is, I think, I would probably say more understood and more acceptable in the scientific community to see that their own research needs to be put to use for the betterment of societies is now almost axiomatic. So we understand that that is one of the roles of scientific research. Not the only role, obviously. There's a huge place for fundamental science, but to understand the science community as foundational to a country's resilience, either geopolitical or environmental, biodiversity, all of that, it has become, I would say, an actor on that scene as well.
You mentioned about mission-driven, especially in the global context. And how do you think the science diplomacy practitioners should actually, in practical terms, in operational sense, be prepared for emergencies like pandemic we had or the situations of war? What role, how do they play in that role, and what operational practices would make it more effective to do that?
Yeah. Well, you said the word yourself, preparedness, right? And what does that look like? And I can only say that you can't prepare overnight. Preparedness takes a long time, and it takes building relationships. Diplomats know this. They know that relationships are the currency of their work. Scientists know that relationships are the currency of their scholarship, but increasingly viewing those relationships in interaction, I think, is important. So I guess what I'm saying here is to build and to maintain those networks of personal interactions cannot be overlooked as a really important and key tool. And I'll just give you one example that I know of here in the Canadian context. I'm originally from Canada, and I've spent time working in the federal government here, and as well as where I am based now in New Zealand. But I know that in Canada, your own chief science advisor, before the pandemic, held a tabletop exercise on pandemic preparedness. And at the time, because I was working with her office, it felt a little bit theoretical, figuring out who was who in the system, who would we need to talk to if anything should arise, who are the people, do we know them, have we met them, do we know their names, do we know where they sit? And it was a bit of a theoretical exercise, and wouldn't you know it, those very people were the ones that that network needed to be engaged not long after. So in some ways it was quite prescient, but the lesson from that is those exercises, those relationships are important to build in the good times, so that they're ready for the bad times.
You mentioned that having the preparedness in the good times, but as we are seeing that science becoming more politically charged, especially with some recent developments in United States and some global developments as well. How do we keep that relevance and maintain trust in these institutions in these more politically charged times?
Yeah, it's true that, probably Canada's no exception. I think we're seeing across many countries now a real sort of shift in even public sentiment around trusting institutions. And science is an institution. And so the populist shift to really questioning, the so-called elite institutions, we're seeing that everywhere. And I think that the research community has a really important role to play, to show themselves to be open, accessible, available. It's not every scientist who will put themselves in front of a camera for the media or who will make a TikTok video. But it might be some people in their group. It might be some of their graduate students. It might be others who will increasingly embrace an openness to communication. And that goes as much for public communication as it does for communication to policymakers. And I think that the research community has a really important role to play there. In my organization, INGSA, we are working with the International Science Council on developing some training around and some sort of direction pointing around how this work can be done. How do you reach out across these types of divides, across these types of borders? What kind of skills are needed? And then also reflecting back on the institutions where scientists sit, what kind of institutional design changes are required to support them to do this kind of work, so that it's not all just publish or perish, so that their work of engagement and communication and outreach is actually understood and valued.
So you just mentioned about science communication and how scientific institutions should also take steps in developing this change on evolving that one. And recently in Canada, we have also seen that tri-council agencies have started allocating a certain portion of scholarship and funding to make sure that science communication is part of the development for early career researchers and scientists. How do you think the governments and the funding organizations should take this into context, and make more operational effectiveness? Because as scientists, as early career researchers or everything, it's always about fundamental research, publish or preparation, this huge competitiveness. The communication always takes a backseat. Universities, there's not enough incentive for that. How do you think the funders, government should incentivize that kind of more on that one?
Yeah, well, you your question led with the example of what the Tri-Council are putting in place now, and I think that is really great to see, and it's been a long time in the making, of course, to be able to create a pathway, a career pathway for knowledge brokers, right? We've talked about knowledge brokership in all sorts of different contexts through INGSA in the past, but it's always been a sort of cobbled together way of doing something off the side of somebody's desk. But when there's actual funding put in place for this, when there are people who can be trained to do this, then you start to see a field being built. Then you start to see a career pathway. Then you start to see a whole cadre of emerging practitioners being trained in knowledge brokerage, and that is, I don't want to say it's new, but it's newly starting to be institutionalized. And how is it being institutionalized? Mostly through the funding. And so if we can see more funders with that kind of enlightened way of thinking, to include that sort of knowledge mobilization, knowledge brokership as a distinct career pathway and as a recognized and valued career pathway, then I think not only does that get messages out about all sorts of important, scientific knowledge that the public can use, but it builds trust because it increases that space, it closes that gap, it closes that space between researchers and their various publics through knowledge brokerage.
Yeah, that was very informative. I think we are seeing recent changes in the governments and institutions taking these steps. But I also think, as you said, more universities and the bodies need to include that as part of the training process. That is very important for increasing trust in the science domain, as we discussed. And finally, you're here at CSPC, and in your opinion, what is you see as a value of CSPC in the science policy ecosystem as a knowledge mobilizer, a talent incubator in Canada and other, as well as how does this role play, not just in Canada, you coming from New Zealand, how do you see that being in other countries as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, at the risk of sounding like just a giddy fan of CSPC, I have to say it's just so amazing to see how the organization has grown over its, relatively short lifetime so far. The quality and the quality of discussion, the quality of engagement, the level of people that it's attracting has just, it's just going from strength to strength. And I think increasingly, especially in the last few years, we've seen it internationalize somewhat as well, which I think is so important because, it can feel a little bit a closed shop if it's just, and of course there's so much to be discussed in the Canadian context. So I think that's really important to give yourselves some space to do that. But I think as Canada is looking at developing new and diversified international partnerships, the CSPC has a massive role to play there. And it's only just, I feel, scratching the surface of that role. And it can only, grow from here because I think all of the conditions are in place now. And I'm really excited to see its future and indeed to be part of its future. I love coming to this conference. It's one of my favorites.
Thank you. You mentioned how this, especially evolving with the Canadian trade relationship and how this also CSPC is internationalizing. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for coming and taking part in the interview series. Thank you.
Thank you so much.